After Germany elected a new parliament in February, last Tuesday was finally the day that the new Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, was supposed to be officially confirmed by parliament and sworn in. Except that things didn't exactly go as planned, and for the first time in the history of post-war Germany, the candidate for Chancellor failed to get the necessary number of votes to be appointed. Let's talk about what happened. Hello, servus, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Feli. I'm originally from Munich, Germany, but I've been living here in Cincinnati, Ohio since 2016. So what happened? On February 23rd, Germany held a snap election after the previous government, or in the US you'd say the previous administration, had fallen apart in the fall. I made several videos explaining all of that at the time that I'll link down below for you guys. These were the election results, and since none of the parties received over 50% of the votes, the next step after the election was for a coalition to be formed, as is pretty much always the case in Germany. There were different party combinations on the table that could have gotten together to reach that 50% threshold, but the most obvious one was a coalition of CDU-CSU, also called the Union, which are the Christian Conservatives, and the SPD, the Social Democrats. So they started negotiations and finally introduced their coalition agreement, the Koalitionsvertrag, on April 9th. That's a document where the coalition parties write down their mutual policy goals for the upcoming term and decide which party gets to run which ministries. These coalition agreements usually require the parties to agree to a good amount of compromises in order to find common ground with each other. We'll get back to the coalition agreement later, but after it was finalized, each of the technically three parties, since the union consists of two sub-parties, held internal votes about whether the coalition agreement was officially accepted by the party or not. How the parties go about these votes is up to them. The Bavarian party CSU had their party executives as well as their federal and state representatives vote on it. The CDU had a so-called Kleiner Parteitag, so a small party convention, vote on it. And the SPD actually asked all of their 350,000 members to vote in a 2-week-long online vote, and almost 85% of them voted yes, meaning they supported and accepted the coalition agreement. So after all of that was finalized at the end of April, the parties officially signed the coalition agreement this past Monday on May 5th, and the next day, May 6th, is when the official election of the Chancellor was scheduled for. Now, if you're thinking, wait, I thought the election already took place in February. Yes, that is correct, but unlike the US, which has a presidential system, Germany has a parliamentary election system, which means that we, the citizens, elect the parliament, and the parliament then decides who among them gets to form the governing coalition, and they're the ones who elect the Chancellor. I did explain the German election system a little more in detail in some of my past videos, by the way. I'll link all of those down below. So that official election, where the new German parliament, the Bundestag, gets together to elect the new Chancellor, aka the head of government, took place this past Tuesday. In addition to the members of parliament themselves, there were also countless journalists and guests in attendance, such as former Chancellor Angela Merkel, Merz's family, and even German celebrities like the astronaut Alexander Gerst, climate activist Luisa Neubauer, and DFB president Bernd Neuendorf. The vote itself was really just a formality. Friedrich Merz had even brought a 10-liter beer keg to celebrate after, but then something unexpected happened.
Mit Ja haben gestimmt 310 der Abgeordneten, mit Nein haben gestimmt 307, Enthaltungen 3. Der Abgeordnete Friedrich Merz hat die erforderliche Mehrheit von mindestens 316 Stimmen nicht erreicht.
Friedrich Merz didn't get enough votes. This had actually never happened before in the history of the Federal Republic of Germany. Usually, once the parties have formed a coalition and signed the coalition agreements, they're all on the same page. And when the Chancellor vote takes place, it's assumed that all of the parliament members of the coalition parties vote for the Chancellor, while all of the opposition parties vote against him. And since the coalition has more than 50% of the parliament seats, their candidate gets elected and the administration can get started. started. Well, not in this case. If we look at the numbers, we can see that Union and SPD clearly have more than 50% of the seats, 328 to be exact. Merz only needed 316 votes to be elected chancellor, but somehow he only received 310, which means that he was 6 votes short. This is the summary you can find on Ground News, by the way. Their goal is to make the media landscape more transparent and to combat media bias by comparing how news outlets, both nationally and internationally, have reported on one and the same story. And they've really been making a big difference. Even the Nobel Peace Center recently said that Ground News is an excellent way to stay informed, avoid echo chambers, and expand your worldview. The story about Merz was pretty big last week. Ground News shows 362 news sources, and as you can see, it was covered slightly more often by left-leaning outlets. You can even click through the different headlines right here and compare them side by side to see the angle from which the story was covered. This right-leaning newspaper from France, for example, brings up the far-right German party AfD in the headline and how they called for new parliamentary elections. That's a focus that most of the other headlines don't have. In addition to the political leaning of the outlet, Ground News also always shows you who the outlet is owned by and how factually accurate their reporting usually is. Of course, you can also use Ground News in the app on your phone, and one of my favorite ways to use it is the Chrome extension that just pops up at the top when I'm on a news page and gives me a quick breakdown on the outlet and the story right here, and gives me a direct link to Ground News if I want to look into this further. This comes in handy all the time when I do research for my videos. What I also really appreciate, especially in today's political climate, is the blind spot feed that shows you which stories were disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum. This is super helpful to get out of your own echo chamber and see what's being covered on the other side of the aisle and how these stories are being covered. So if you're also looking for a better way to stay informed, I recommend checking out Ground News using my link ground.news/Feli, or just scan this QR code right here to get a whole 40% off of the Vantage plan, which is the plan I have. Pretty good deal, and of course you can also find all the details down below in the video description. So what exactly went wrong here? Well, that's the million-dollar question that everyone was asking on Tuesday. And to be honest, that's what people are still wondering to this day. 18 people from the coalition parties must have voted against what was supposed to be their chancellor candidate. But since the vote is done anonymously, nobody knows who those people were and why they did it. Was it representatives from the SPD who weren't quite happy with the compromises made in the coalition agreement? With the cabinet appointments? Was it people from Merz's own party, the CDU, or the Bavarian sister party, CSU? Fact is, Friedrich Merz has been a controversial candidate, even within his own party, due to controversial statements about refugees and homosexuality in the past, due to his rather conservative and economically liberal stance, which is very different from the more centric leadership under Angela Merkel, who was also from the CDU. And many people also criticize his corporate ties, his lack of governing experience, as well as his divisive rhetoric during the election campaign. It's possible that some of the representatives simply wanted to make a statement with their votes, but didn't expect so many others to do the same. Maybe they wanted to show Merz that he doesn't have full support and is walking on thin ice. At the end of the day, we can only guess. What's for sure is that everyone was pretty caught off guard, and even the parliament itself had to figure out how to proceed after this, and actually had to look up what the constitution indicates for this scenario. Because again, this had literally never happened before, and nobody anticipated this. Now, in addition to the shock and surprise about the situation, there was also a lot of criticism coming both from German citizens and international critics. Because after the German government had pretty much been on hold for the last 6 months, unable to weigh in on major decisions regarding international conflicts, the world has anxiously been awaiting the new German government to come into power and finally move forward. And this failed start undermined confidence in the stability of the incoming administration. And within Germany, even people who don't usually support Merz were demanding the coalition get their act together and show some unity on Tuesday. A lot of people felt like it wasn't the right time for petty protest votes, and that this chaos only played into the hands of the AfD. Now, according to the German constitution, if a chancellor candidate doesn't get enough votes to be confirmed, parliament has 14 days to repeat the vote as many times as they want, and it's also possible to nominate one or several other chancellor candidates during this time. If within those 14 days, none of those candidates can get an absolute majority of over 50%, a chancellor can then be elected with just a simple majority, which the German president, the Bundespräsident, could then either choose to appoint, or the president could also decide to dissolve parliament instead and initiate new parliamentary elections. That's the theory. So on Tuesday, after everyone was pretty confused at first, the consensus kind of was that parliament will most likely get together again in a few days to repeat the vote. But then the parliament members suddenly decided to continue their session and vote about whether or not they wanted to do another chancellor vote right away. More than 2/3 of the members voted yes, which met the requirements. So just a few hours after that big disaster on Tuesday, everyone got back together for a second chancellor vote, and this time the results came back as follows.
Mit Ja haben gestimmt 325 Abgeordnete. Mit Nein haben gestimmt 289 und Enthaltung eine.
So despite that first hiccup, Friedrich Merz was eventually elected as Germany's Chancellor on Tuesday.
Frau Präsidentin, ich bedanke mich für das Vertrauen und ich nehme die Wahl an.
He was officially appointed by Bundespräsident Frank-Walter Steinmeier later that day, alongside all of the incoming ministers, and sworn in parliament. But what made the people who voted against him in the first round change their mind all of a sudden and vote for him in the second round? Again, nobody really knows. Most people are guessing that they probably didn't intend for their vote to actually ruin the chancellor vote, and therefore changed their mind to make sure the new government could move forward. Maybe there were also some internal conversations that took place during the break, or who knows, maybe there were even some people from the opposition parties who ended up voting for Merz to ensure a successful second vote. Since it was all anonymous, we'll probably never know. What we do know, though, is that this is Germany's new cabinet for the next 4 years, unless there are early elections again. The head of government is, of course, Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who belongs to the Union. The role of Vice Chancellor and Finance Minister goes to the head of the SPD, Lars Klingbeil, who's a well-known politician in Germany. The only returning minister who gets to stick around from the previous government is Defense Minister Boris Pistorius, because let's not forget that the SPD is the party Scholz was from, and they were one of 3 governing parties for the last 3.5 years. Now they're part of the government again, but in a more supporting role this time. Pistorius is actually considered to be the most popular politician in Germany right now, which is why many people would have liked to see him run for chancellor instead of having Scholz run again, but he simply didn't want to. In total, the Union gets to fill 10 of the federal ministries, and the SPD gets 7. What stood out when the parties announced their picks for the different ministries was that Merz and the Union went with a lot of candidates who either don't have a background in politics at all or who have only been in politics for a short amount of time, such as Carsten Wildberger, who is now the minister of the brand new Ministry for Digitalization and State Modernization. Up until last week, he was the CEO of Germany's biggest electronics stores, MediaMarkt and Saturn, and has never been involved in politics before. He wasn't even a party member. The new Minister for Economic Affairs and Energy, Katharina Reiche, used to be a member of parliament up until 2015 and even served in the government under Merkel, but has recently been working as a lobbyist and a higher-up for the German energy company E.ON. And for the federal government commissioner for culture and the media, so not quite a minister, but still an important role, Merz picked the right-wing journalist and publisher Wolfram Weimar, for which he received a lot of public criticism. Among other things, Weimar founded the political magazine Cicero and has gained attention for controversial statements regarding conservative values and his take on Germany's multikulti. And even the SPD picked someone with a more corporate background to lead the Ministry for Housing, Urban Development and Building, 37-year-old Verena Huberts, an entrepreneur who only went into politics in 2021. Generally, the SPD picked a relatively young group of ministers, and 4 out of their 7 ministers are women. For the Union, one of the most prominent faces returning to the cabinet is Alexander Dobrindt, who used to be transport minister under Merkel and is probably best remembered for his failed attempt to roll out road tolls on the German Autobahn, the German interstate system. Generally, the union has received quite a lot of criticism for their ministry picks, especially for only picking one minister from East Germany, for picking so many people without significant political experience, and also for moving into a more conservative but less Christian direction overall. To get back to the coalition agreement and what this new government is planning for the next 4 years, that's actually a good question. I feel like most reactions to the agreement have pointed out that it's a little too vague in a lot of regards. What I can tell you is that it's titled Verantwortung für Deutschland, so responsibility for Germany, and one of the key phrases at the beginning states, Germany can successfully master every task on its own and in close cooperation with our partners and friends in the world. So there's definitely a strong emphasis on alliances. Upon signing the agreement, Merz also stated that with this, Germany is back on track and that Europe can rely on Germany because the new government has a strong plan to bring our country to the forefront again. The focus of the coalition agreement seems to be on revitalizing the German economy, on defense and modernizing the German military, and on implementing stricter migration policies with continued border checks and accelerated deportations. Some of the main points of criticism about the agreement have been that the financial plan for boosting the economy hasn't really been thought through, and that almost all of the points in the agreement come with a caveat that says that some of these points might not be able to implement if the budget doesn't allow for it. Critics also brought up that the document barely touches on major issues such as climate change, the social security system, as well as healthcare and the nursing industry, and human rights organizations are concerned about the legality of the intended migration policies. In his first few days in office, Merz has already visited France, Poland, and Ukraine, and together with other European leaders, he called for an unconditional 30-day ceasefire in Ukraine, urging President Putin to extend the recent 3-day truce. They also talked to President Trump about this, who stated that he was in support of it as well. Merz announced that Germany would stop reporting arms deliveries to Ukraine in order to achieve strategic ambiguity, but emphasized that Germany will continue to support Ukraine. Alongside French President Macron, Merz has presented a united stance against Trump's trade policies and has called for zero tariffs during a phone conversation with Trump on Thursday. And Interior Minister Dobrindt has ordered asylum seekers to be rejected at Germany's borders. Those are just the first few days in office for the new German government, so we'll see how this will play out long term. Let's just hope for less internal conflict compared to the last government. What do you guys think of all of this? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoy my videos and find them helpful, be sure to hit the subscribe button, the thumbs up button, and of course you can also find me on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Patreon, and as of recently even on Spotify if you want to watch or listen to my videos on there. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope I'll see you next time. Tschüss!